Perfect. All right, guys, I want to welcome in Jonathan Buttry, who has decided to take the hot seat again here as we move further and further into this series of discussing things that are not on the most mass media list, mass believers list when you want to start looking into Christianity and topics. Usually you find things, salvation, how should we be living today, that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, things that the hot button issues that are deemed heretical and all these kind of things. You get pushed to the side, don't discuss. Well, we never hear about them. So with this series, that was the goal is to get past debates and shouting matches and get down to some information. And with us tonight, moving into one of those topics, is Jonathan Buttry, who has a podcast and a Facebook group, and he's been doing stuff for years. He's a well of knowledge, and we're gonna dip into what he has to say today because he comes from a position where he has adopted the view of universalism. Now, that's a loaded belief system based upon what other people have already said about it. So, if you're already a believer and you've heard terms about salvation, this, that, who's right, who's wrong, who's going to hell, and who's not, you've probably heard there's people out there who believe that everybody is saved. And that's the stupidest thing in the world. How could that be possible? Now, I'm not saying I'm a universalist or I'm not. I'm not. I actually at one time did hold the universalism point of view, and as I grew, my views changed as well. So I'm not here to tell you that you need to change your views and be a universalist, and Jonathan's not here to tell you that either. I'm not here to tell you you shouldn't be. But what we should do is listen to people, give them a chance to actually say, this is why. I don't want to have to fight and argue with you, but I have a reason. I'm not a stupid person just because I disagree with you. And that's the point of the show. And I want to thank Jonathan for jumping on here. I want to give you a minute and let everybody know where they can find you and then give you the floor. So, again, thank you so much. You didn't have to do this. I appreciate you taking the hot seat because the last thing people want is the attention of being more on the outside of the mainstream. So, thanks for being here, Jonathan.
Well, Dallas, I appreciate you having me on. I just would get right in and say that, of course, we have a podcast called The Legion of Heretics. We have discussions on lots of topics. We generally try to go through scripture and introduce people to ideas such as preterism or introduce them to other theological perspectives that they don't normally hear. Thus, that's why we call it the Legion of Heretics. Right now, we're just doing it on Facebook. You can look on our Facebook page at mine if you want to look at my personal Facebook page, or we have the Holston Primitive Baptist Universalist Church page where we post most of our discussions. And there's good information there. We have several meeting houses in Tennessee, Virginia, in Ohio and Kentucky, where we're in the Primitive Baptist Universalist tradition. And if you want to know more about that, you can look, of course, Google that, and you'll see on Wikipedia or other resources about that particular tradition. And, you can find us there, drop us a line. We generally don't do a lot of other social media other than just Facebook at this moment. That serves us very well. So appreciate the opportunity to plug those resources.
Right on. So, and I'd say if you want to listen, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of people giving us good listening in the views of fulfilled eschatology and those kind of topics. And if that's something you're interested in, jump over to the Legion of Heretics because whether you like it or not, they're talking about it. And if you want to listen to it, you can definitely do it. So, before we get going too deep into a lot of these cool side trails and awesome rabbit holes that can keep us tied down for a bit when we want to talk about these more non-mainstream views. I want to give you an opportunity, Jonathan, to just lay this out because coming from my history, I have a completely different take on universalism as we were just chatting about from where you're coming from. So I think it's only fair to let you explain what does universalism mean from your tradition, and then on top of it, maybe where it comes from, why you ended up in that position, and then give us some doctrinal points, some good heavy scriptures to say, this is why I was converted. We have an opportunity. No one's going to jump in and interrupt you because you're a heretic here. So feel free, Jonathan. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, just take a moment too to say that originally I'd started out as a Southern Baptist and started when I was 15 years old preaching. So I had a lot of fire and started out as a revival hellfire and brimstone preacher. So I've been through that journey. I had gotten a little older, started pastoring churches in my 20s, realized I better start learning and knowing something about what I'm saying so I can lay a foundation and be a church leader. So in doing so, I went and learned more about theology and Christian church history. And by doing that, I discovered the Reformed faith. So in my mid 20s, I came to Calvinism and the Reformed faith and started to really dig in and loved studying philosophy and history and just really enjoyed all that. Sort of went through my mad Calvinist phase, just being angry, that thought I'd been lied to for all these years, and of course went through different phases. Came to preterism about the same time that I did Calvinism. So it was nice to sort of come to that early enough to maybe avoid some other issues down the road. But I've been a full preterist for at least over 20 years now. In the late 90s, I suppose, is when I came to that, just like I did Calvinism.
I just want to jump in here quick for 1 second. For those who
Yeah.
are not too familiar, would you express, quickly what the fundamental point of Calvinism is, I guess, because that's a big point of your history, and I
Yeah.
don't think a lot of people might be familiar with that.
Well, what got me to thinking about it was, of course, this whole notion of the fire that I had in me early on as a revival preacher was I needed to get out and get as many people to believe in Jesus and go to heaven as I could to avoid going to hell. And I thought, well, if I don't, I'll have blood on my hands, and I really took that serious. But when I came to Calvinism, I understood the 5 points, which is basically that man is totally depraved, that God, before the foundation of the world, unconditionally elected all that uh, would come to faith, that Jesus came and through his death at the time, of course, this is basic Calvinistic thought, is that whoever Jesus died for, Jesus can't fail. So if he doesn't fail, then he couldn't have died for everybody. So he had to die only for the elect. So that's limited atonement. So the atonement was just for the elect. And of course, you have irresistible grace, which means that all those that Jesus died for will come to him in faith. And then finally, you've got the perseverance, or what we call preservation of the saints, that God will not lose any that he purchased and brought to faith, and that they'd ultimately be with him in heaven. Now, that made sense to me at the time because I thought, well, why doesn't God just save everybody? And I thought, well, this makes sense to me that because in my mind, I knew God was a big God. God was sovereign. I had that in my mind early on, that how could God fail? If God wanted to do something, it wouldn't make sense that God would try to do something. That wouldn't be much of a God. That would be more like in line with the Greek or Roman gods that would try to do things, just couldn't get it done. But
That would also create a lot of conflict in Scripture, because, like, the one that jumps to my mind even is our God is not a feeble God; He can do what He wants. I'm just paraphrasing, but obviously, yeah. So I can see your point there.
yeah, so that was the big issue with me, was how does sovereignty play out? So if everyone isn't saved, because again, I hadn't really dealt with the hell question at the time, then that would make sense to me that God can't fail, so he's definitely going to save at least a portion of mankind. I came to the primitive Baptist faith at the time because that was the one in the tradition that was sort of a mainline Baptist reform movement. And they had a very strong emphasis on the sovereignty of God and in predestination. So I was there for a while until about my early 30s. I started to really dig in more and understand, how to I really rethought a lot of concepts like heaven or hell or the resurrection, not necessarily because of my preterist understanding, even though that did play into some of it, but just in general, some of my philosophical assumptions. And it just didn't make sense. Eternal conscious torment just began to not make sense to me. So I began to consider other positions like annihilationism, and universalism was the last one that I would really tackle, because I thought there's no way I'll ever be a universalist. If I was going to do that, I'd just go back to being a free will Baptist or an Arminian of some sort, or a Methodist. So I kind of wrestled around with that, but my philosophical assumptions led me to embrace a Calvinistic form of universalism where God cannot fail to do everything that God would want to do. And I just couldn't see, again, not because of just God's love. This is where a lot of Christian universalists stand and where we differ from them, and I'll explain more about that. But we don't believe, of course, that it's God's love that is the anchor of our universalist understanding. Of course, we believe in universal reconciliation. We don't hold to universal salvation. We hold those as distinct categories, and I'll again explain more about that. But so I reevaluated all this, began to embrace this universalist perspective from a Calvinistic point of view, which I'll explain again. And I embraced a tradition within primitive Baptists that's called the Primitive Baptist Universalists. And this is where I came to land and found that this tradition speaks most to me, and I can live here and minister and do so locally. We have local congregations. We're not just people online talking about these things. We're actually engaged in doing ministry locally. So basically, our position, it's within the Christian Universalist traditions. There's different perspectives, and again, our perspective is we try to sum it up in these four presuppositions, which kind of give us the foundation for it. The first presupposition is the absolute sovereignty of God. The second is a non-literal approach to scriptures. So we're very critical. We do critical studies. Again, we don't embrace inerrancy or infallibility of scriptures, even though because of that, that doesn't mean we discard it and think very little of it. But we think very highly. We believe in the veracity, of course, of these texts because they're Jewish and Christian texts that we should study and understand as best we can and apply them in ways that are meaningful and healthy. Thirdly, we embrace a preterist interpretation of all prophetic literature, which means we're full preterists. So we embrace the fact that all prophetic literature is poetic and apocalyptic in nature, and it doesn't mean that we interpret, as some full preterists do, every jot and tittle pointing to some always very specific point in history. We take more of a general approach. And as I was explaining to Dallas earlier, I don't hold to a predictive approach to the preterist understanding. That's still those that hold on to more of the inerrancy or the infallibility or more of the evangelical perspective that some hold to, where they would still see those texts as prophesying of future events that had their fulfillment in history. We believe in we practice the explanatory approach, which again, we don't argue whether or not Revelation or the Gospels were written before 70 AD or after. That's not really our concern. We're okay to take what mainstream critical scholars and say that most of it was probably written after 70 AD. And these are explanatory texts, just like you find in the prophetic literature of the major and minor prophets. So we're in line with critical scholarship there, not because we're brilliant and we know it all. That just makes the most sense to us. So that's our sort of full preterism as far as that's concerned. And then fourthly, we have an insistence on a thinking faith. So we ground ourselves in rationalism. We reject mysticism. Oftentimes when people hear the name primitive Baptists, they'll ask us, well, do you handle snakes, or do you practice speaking in tongues and things like that? No, no. And we're not King James only. We don't believe in inerrancy, so we have to go through those explanations that, we believe in rationalism and a thinking faith. We believe in
So it's
enlightenment.
not connected to an evolutionary dinosaur belief system.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, 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 exactly. So, and as far as these are concerned, these presuppositions, uh, you know, the absolute sovereignty of God. Some will believe in the sovereignty of God. We believe in a hard determinism when it comes to our understanding of sovereignty. So, as as Christian Universalists or as Primitive Baptist Universalists, we define the absolute sovereignty of God just like you'd find in the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is that God from all eternity did by most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatever comes to pass. And in philosophical terms, we believe, or we hold to the position of hard determinism, which you can find in, you know, you can see defined by people like William James, the philosophical pragmatist who defined it that the belief that human actions and choices are causally determined by forces and influences over which a person exercises really no meaningful control. That we're born with cognitive abilities or brain structures, or we're put in environments that we didn't choose to be placed into, or bodies, or these types of things. We're put into the world, with the way we are, and we didn't choose that. So we believe in absolute predestination as far as that. So again, we would root our understanding of universalism and universal reconciliation in that truth, or in that presupposition, because we take, of course, a position just like where we would maximize God's omniscience and omnipotence, and we hold to what Paul Tillich calls the understanding of God as the ground of all being, and Aristotle his unmoved mover. So this position is opposite to, of course, open theism or process thought, where God is sovereign, but he's not really sovereign. He's sort of they redefine what that means. So we're on the opposite end of that spectrum.
So with that, then, does that, from your position, because what just pops into my head to see how far apart that is, do you believe then, which is obviously a mainstream belief today, is that God has individual relationships with people and he communicates individually with them in some manner?
No, we wouldn't hold to that view. We would hold to more of a general view of God as creator. Like I say, it would be akin to sort of a deist perspective, where God creates everything and everything is ordained in such a way that we don't by our prayers and tears change God's plans, because that would mean that the world would be changeable based on sort of temporal or emotional pleas, and you've got all these differing interests that God would have to be pulling all sorts of chess moves that wouldn't even make sense after a while. When if he's answering everybody's prayers and wants everything done a certain way, then I would hate to live in a world like that. It would just be absolute chaos. So we believe in a linear view of history, that God uses cause and effect, and that again, we root this in rationality, and because of the intelligibility of the world, that we can predict certain things, just like uh, what Hume referred to as the problem of induction, which is we believe the future is like the past. If I go to get toothpaste out of the tube, when I squeeze it, I don't expect elephants to come out of the walls. I expect toothpaste to come out. So, there's a cause and effect built into creation itself, and it's inductive reasoning that this is how you come up with being able to predict if you do the same recipe. I mean, if you want to make biscuits, then you have a certain recipe to make them, and so you can get at least some predictability and intelligibility in the world.
So then, how would you? And the two things come to mind. I don't want to go too deep into each of it because you're going to bring up a lot of interesting talking points, but I don't want to derail you too much. One scripture that pops up that I think brings a lot of interesting conversation to support that position, and that's when Jesus taught people how to pray. And what he told them was, to pray not for this, that, or, don't pray like these people, repeating things over and over, but rather just say, God, your will be done. So that removes that dilemma that you're talking about, is if God's will be done and everyone just stands back and stops trying to petition him for all these different things, well, that would make a logical more sense that God is more managing and governing as opposed to micromanaging and stuff. So that's an interesting view. But it also would bring into heavy conflict in my also second example, where Abram was able to have a conversation with God and change his mind on the destruction in Sodom. So I would say I could see definitely how there would be scriptures that could support that position, but I'd also say, just even off the top of my head, there would be scriptures that would seem to not go along with that, which there's a lot on both sides. These are just one on each. So I don't know if you wouldn't mind speaking to either one of those. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, though that's no problem. Of course, I'm sure you would know that we would, of course, say that Abram, the historicity of Abram changing God's mind is not something that we would hold to. So these are stories that teach us truths, and I think there's deeper, more meaningful truths there than just Abram, changing Yahweh's mind in some way. So now we wouldn't hold that as a historical fact or as an objective or ontological truth. But that, and of course, just like you're saying about prayer, that's the first question people always have. What about prayer? Why wouldn't you pray? Well, prayer can mean a lot of things. Prayer can be meditation. Prayer can be, therapy where you're just getting things off your chest. Prayer can be a good practice. That's, of course, being consistent with our understanding. We don't necessarily hold prayer in our meeting houses or our church services, because again, we're not trying to inform God of something. We don't believe we can inform him or educate God about our circumstances or anything, but that can be, prayer can be very therapeutic and it can be helpful at times, especially if it's done together. We're in the community. But we wouldn't say that it has some ontological reality to it where you're touching base with God and you're getting something, you're bargaining with him to get something from him in some way, so you can change the fabric of reality and bend it to your will, because that's more mysticism or magical thinking.
Our family would tend to agree, not to the full extent in which you described, but we've moved away. We don't petition. My son likes to petition just because he's a child, and we don't stop him. We want him to learn to be able to ask freely, especially of God, who wants to give wisdom, in my opinion. So, and just like every immature relationship, it starts by giving out handfuls of, physical and, meaningless gestures of love and, appreciation. So we don't hold him back. But when it comes to us, unless it's something that, and I agree, it's not so much like I need to pray to God to ask him to make sure our house stands. But if we're in the middle of a storm, my heart is swaying. So it's my heart that reaches out to console itself, saying, I trust in you. So there is that self-soothing aspect. But in general, I'd have to say we're probably at a 95 to 98%. We're just thankful. But we have nothing else to say. God, we know what God, we have no doubt that yesterday God fed us, today God will feed us, and tomorrow he will also. So we have no need to pray. But what we do need to do is still walk in acknowledgement of those truths. And I think that's where we've moved to, is to the thankfulness. And so I can see your points on some of those ideas. But I would still take that to the next step and say, I do find a personal relationship, and I'm not into mysticism and all that in the same position, but I cannot deny the weird coincidences, which I don't call them that anymore because I cannot deny the uh, direct results of prayers and the direct results of outcomes of those prayers. So for me, I still do see a personal aspect of interaction with, because I would just divide it as the impersonal and the personal God. And I think that's it. Would that be fair from your position?
Yeah, I mean, we're not out to take anything away from people. So prayer is not something that we would actively discourage people. We would just say that again, there's lots of people that need certain things from faith or religion or from their personal relationship and things like that. Just like me, I personally don't enjoy standing and saluting the American flag as if I'm giving my allegiance to the government. But I wouldn't, I wouldn't get up and get angry at people or tell people to stop that. Stop pledging allegiance to the government. And I wouldn't do it in a way that would you know I I don't want to just go against the grain just to prove a point, things like that, because I don't think that's helpful at all, because we're here to hopefully help each other and encourage each other. But
Well, there's definitely a biblical precedent and obviously a social, psychological, emotional connection to a prayerful, spiritual based life,
yeah,
connecting to the Creator in some way.
yeah.
God wouldn't have commanded the Israelites to live such a life if it was pointless and meaningless.
Mhm.
So I do believe there's something to it, but I do agree with you that in general, it's probably been made into something it probably isn't, and that's why we've moved away a lot from it as well. So sorry to just bump you off your train tracks there for a little bit, but it was kind of cool little rabbit trail. So let you
No,
keep
no,
going.
no. That's fine, and that actually would tie into our position on uh, you know why there's evil in the world and things like that, because we can intellectually give a reason why that there's evil in the world, but that doesn't solve the emotional problem of it. And we wouldn't want to be insensitive to people to say, just because you could intellectualize something, that emotionally answers questions, because people go through people do suffer. And we hold funerals. Now we don't necessarily uh, we don't hold that there's a geographical place somewhere in the universe called heaven that we go to when we die. The afterlife for us is basically the body goes back to the dust and the spirit goes to God that gave it. So again, we believe in universal reconciliation, that we leave these mortal bodies and our spirit ascends to God, whatever that means. When we have funerals, I don't purposely get up and try to bash people over the head with whatever views that they have of the afterlife, because again, you don't want to be insensitive to people, but uh, we still try to be consistent within our framework, and that's about the best you can do, really. So these are not easy positions to hold.
Okay, well then I'll have to ask you the tough one. Then is Hitler in heaven with God?
Well, there's no heaven. there's there's no heaven, but that's all. That's the first one people always go to, is Hitler, and I always wonder why they don't go to Mao or Genghis Khan or
It's
Napoleon.
not a friendly most propaganda. Because
Yeah,
mine is always, well, what about Russia? It
yeah,
was literally right before it, and so
yeah,
yeah. But
yeah,
I agree. But that's a fair question though, because if you're
yeah,
going to tell people that someone can be that diabolical,
yeah,
and even if he didn't obtain the goals that we read, because there's some people out there who might deny the numbers thrown, there was no doubt that he did things,
yeah, yeah.
and things were written from his perspective, and the people that Goebbels and these guys that
Mhm.
were part of his regime. There, the evils associated with it. There's no doubt about it. We could say the same about certain organizations making plays in the world right now as well. There is evil in the world. So when we take a look at those things, it's a serious conversation. How does that apply then? I guess which moves us forward into that. Sure, Hitler might have a chance with going to heaven to see God again. Well, then what role does hell play in it? Because I know you said earlier that you've had to come to a different place with that. So
Mm-hmm.
how does Hitler get to heaven with hell? And I know that's a giant can of worms, and it's probably 3 or 4 episode conversations on themselves. But everyone's going to ask then if Hitler can somehow get reconciled to God, if you could define that, and then separate that from salvation and deal with this can of worms of heaven and hell, I guess.
Yeah, that's good. And I would say too, I would put every president we've ever had in the United States in the same category with Hitler too. So they've uh, caused as much uh, havoc and murder and bombed the hell out of children, and I'll just put them all in as murderers that deserve lots of punishment. So I wouldn't exclude any of them, but I can
I
say
would
this.
also say that collectively, the Bible, they only talk about murderers as kingdoms too. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah. So, okay, so I could answer it in this way to say that, uh, let's see, I could, okay, I will approach it this way. Uh, as far as our axiom about God's sovereignty, that every action in the temporal world is ordained from eternity and is causally necessary to bring about a predetermined outcome. Uh, this is where really all other theological systems would be based on the notion that God must punish the disobedient person because the act was a direct attack on God's authority or plan, his best life now for people. But according to this perspective, a temporal agent can act in violation of God's eternal will. Consequently, God must punish this behavior as to being this person, or to bring this person back in line with his eternal plan. Although we don't argue that punishment is unnecessary or an illusion like some traditions do, we would argue that there are temporal human governments that are established to carry out justice, compliance, disobedience, law, with certain ethical and social categories that can only exist in the temporal world of change. And of course, we argue for justice and retribution in the temporal world, believe these are vital to any society, but really have no relevant function in eternity. So, therefore, punishment only makes sense in the temporal sphere and is the only place where it really can be carried out, because when a person leaves a temporal world that only operates in terms of change and enters into the eternal world that only operates in terms of no change, then really punishment doesn't make sense in an eternal realm where there's really no change. So that's why we say that punishment can only really make sense in the temporal world. And if people escape that, then it's not emotionally satisfying. That there are people that make it out of the world that's done atrocities that may have not paid to the full here. But then it brings up the question of, okay, well, how much punishment do they need? Do they need eternal punishment for deeds that they did? Or do they need to be punished for 500 million years? Or do they, what sorts of punishment needs to be meted out? I think to say that punishment will be meted out somewhere in the afterlife too, sort of, um, I think it cheats the importance of how we need to work for justice here in the world, and that we should work to make sure that injustices aren't carried out and that people can just bomb children, just like our governments. There should be no reason why we're sending drones or bombing countries or children, or support any of that. So, um, there's there's no simple and emotionally, or there's no satisfying answer to it. But just to be consistent, we have to hold the view that punishment really only can make sense in a world of change rather than in eternity.
So then, coming from a preterist position, and we see, does that mean? Because I guess the confusion I would be in is, how does judgment continue post 70 A.D. when judgment from a preterist position ended in 70 A.D. and judgment up to that point would only be concerning the covenant people? So how would judgment continue after if Torah covenant ended? I'm just
Yeah,
playing devil's advocate for those of
yeah,
you who might not understand the question.
yeah. And see, that's where our view of judgment would be different. We don't necessarily believe in final judgment as that's it, and there's never ever going to be judgment again, because again, just using the model of the fact that God, where we'd see that you have empires that went into Israel that meted out what they understood to be punishment, and you have the Roman army that's doing the same thing to the Jews in 70 A.D. that they're punishing them. A lot of this has to do with interpretation, and so we wouldn't necessarily see that judgment ends there, because judgment, as far as um, what's carried out among humans, ethical judgment or social judgment, that happens because empires rise and fall and communities rise and fall. But there can be economic, political, local judgments and things like that. So uh, I don't agree with full preterists that just use judgment language with 70 AD and as everything ends there. That doesn't really make any sense with history.
Okay, so that opens up the doors to a lot of interesting conversations, and we're going to start seeing some differences here, which is good, because that's what we
Yeah.
want to hear,
Yeah.
is push into these things that. So, for example, that starts pointing, bringing out a lot of different questions. So, for one, Hitler, if he's in that position and he's doing what he was determined to do, does his salvation or his reconciliation, what position does that put us into then? Because obviously, like, if you're coming from the place that God's judging nations afterwards in the same manner he did before, which can easily be argued,
Yeah.
and the nations, like you said, are being raised up to govern peoples, and Paul clearly says, that's the purpose of these kingdoms, is God's using them to judge, and, keep the unruly ruled. So there is a sense that the law and nations ruling is a God ordained system.
Mhm.
So then, when we take a look at that and we're looking at it from a deterministic point of view, Hitler was supposed to do these atrocities.
Yeah.
But Paul does argue for that, because he says Pharaoh was made for
Yeah.
those atrocities in order that Israel would accept and that Egypt would repent. So if we take a look at that, how does Hitler then settle into, maybe this is where we got to get you to define, why would he be, well, what would the difference be between that reconciliation you get with God versus having a salvation? What would then that, because that becomes a big difference to me.
Mhm.
Because, like, me as a listening to you going, well, why do I want salvation then if I'm not going to die and go to heaven? Why? What does reconciled mean then? Because I thought I was reconciled in God. So from a mass, not the mass, but from the mass perspective, those terms I think are going to become very important to divide here.
Yeah, that's where I say that universal reconciliation would be that we all come from God. Everything comes from God and ultimately returns to God. And again, this isn't something I came up with. This is rooted in Paul Tillich's work, where every temporal being and event or substance, comes from the eternal and ultimately returns to the eternal. Salvation is something different, because we speak in terms of coming to faith in Christ or living out certain ethical connections or a certain, like a biblical worldview. And of course, again, this is where our Calvinistic universalism comes into place, where um, somebody that will never come to salvation, they don't want it anyway. Hitler didn't want anything to do with salvation. Um, so it's not like somebody's going to, so we don't take the free will approach that God gives you this choice, and you can consider this and think, well, maybe I should be a Christian, maybe I want to go to heaven, or maybe I don't. It's something innate in us, where uh, either just like there's people that go along in their life that never consider any of this, and all of a sudden their whole life changes and they give their heart to Jesus, and everything changes, and their whole life is just uprooted, and everything now is about serving Christ. And then you have some that serve Christ for years, and then all of a sudden they don't want anything to do with it. They're atheists. They hate it. And then you've got all that kind of in between. You've got good people, you've got evil people, and you've got everything in that spectrum. So this is where psychologically it makes the most sense in our tradition that there's elect that come to faith, and there are those that don't. There's some that come to faith and they reject it. So salvation for us is not like what you find in the evangelical perspective of, I come to Jesus when I'm 9 years old, give my heart to him. And then you have those debates about, can you ever lose your salvation, or are you eternally secure? It,
So what does salvation then mean to you? Because I would have to suggest that in the mainstream view, when we say the term salvation, typically people mean I'm allowed now to go when I die be in heaven forever. So what does
yeah,
salvation then mean to you? Because obviously you guys are in a very different position than that.
yeah.
What are you expecting to be different between a reconciled person versus a saved person with salvation?
Well, I would go to what Paul tells Timothy when he says that if you continue in the doctrine, then you'll save yourself and those that hear you. I don't think Timothy needed to be eternally saved to go to heaven that Paul's talking about there, because if he did he not have it before? When he's talking about that this brings life and immortality to light. So that's what we believe the gospel does, and that salvation is about. It's about helping you understand what you already have. That again, bringing life and immortality to light here in the temporal world is to establish you in a life of discipleship. So it's more about finding freedom through discipleship, understanding who you are in Christ. Not everybody comes to that, and there's different degrees that people experience those things. Some just are good with going to a regular evangelical church, and they hear um, whoever it could be, Joel Osteen or whoever it is, and they're happy with that. They're never going to really dig deep. They're never going to ask the deep questions. That's as far as their faith goes. And, I don't think you could talk some of those people out of it. But then you have some like us that drive ourselves crazy trying to dig in, understand these deeper questions, find more meaningful ways to express our faith. And it sort of makes outcasts of you because you tend to be on the outskirts of those that take this a little too serious.
So then, how would that differentiate from a rec? Because what I'm hearing you say is more about you're walking in the revelation of God in this world and understanding more purpose and life, and just you're not looking for magic, you're looking for meaning.
Yeah.
And so then, if we're getting that salvation, we're getting that light in this world. What would Hitler be then in reconciliation? What would that be different? Because then, obviously, you're suggesting while he was walking in this world, he wouldn't have had that good beneficial thing. Where others would argue maybe, well, he was rich, he was powerful, he was given everything he wanted. In the end, he was betrayed. But I'd trade my 75 years of working as a slave for GM for that. So how, what's different there between the salvation of those walking more for that wisdom and the light versus this reconciliation for someone who obviously wasn't obtaining those kind of same ideals?
Yeah, again, we could kind of look back and say that, how did he die? He died, committed suicide. He was a drug-addled, crazy person. So uh, hating God or living that sort of chaotic, despotic life um, didn't lead to a good end. I mean, whereas you might have somebody that scratches out a living being a garbage person, picking up garbage their whole life, barely making ends meet, that may have their whole family around them when they're leaving this world, and they have this contentment and fulfillment in their life that very few get to enjoy. So I don't know. There's no clear cut answer here as far as that, because everybody experiences life in so many different ways. I think it's for us anyway. It's a little childish to expect everything to be black and white. That good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. That bad people uh, they get rich and they enjoy life, and haha, they get to make fun of the poor people. It's not always the case. You have people that have extreme riches that are miserable, and it's been shown time again. People that are very successful sometimes are the most miserable and depressed people that there are, because we really don't know what goes on in people's hearts or their interpersonal lives. Everything on social media may look great, but their heart, their life's a wreck. And then you have people with mental health issues that can never get their life together. Because I've years ago I've worked in social work, and I worked with homeless population. I've worked with lots of different types of people. Some people are just absolutely in misery, and they'll all tell you that they've accepted Jesus, or, especially here in the South, everybody believes in Jesus here in the South. It's very rare you run into the biggest question here in the South is, where you go to church? You gonna come to our church? Where you go to church? It ain't about whether you know Jesus or not. Um, so I'm not trying to skirt the question. I'm just trying to say that I don't really have a clear cut answer for it, because we can see that salvation is a way of life that doesn't necessarily have to reflect one way of living, where some people try to make it out to be, hey, you get saved, you got Jesus, what else you got to worry about? I mean, it's just the greatest thing ever. No, sometimes having Jesus in your life is misery for some people, because it makes people around them miserable. Or I don't know if you've known some people that have a certain kind of personality that uh, them having Jesus in their life, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so great. you some people commit murder, in the name of Jesus. I'm just saying, there's just um, the problem is, we're so used to evangelicalism and this promise that salvation, what it does, it leads to this life that's just incredible. And we're just not willing in our tradition to say, hey, everybody's life's going to be incredible if you just believe what we tell you, or if you embrace our tradition, you're going to be in good shape. No, I'll be honest, if you embrace our tradition, it's tough. You'll be called the no-hellers, and you're not well thought of. you know, so
I do hear what you're saying in the sense that what you're trying to do is make a bigger conversation out of, and I would agree, what would tend to be a very shallow look at uh, God, who would judge someone by a cut and dry, this you're in and this you're out, considering that we ourselves, as wicked, evil people, don't do that with our own children. We make room for all the grays that they experience. So why would God, who's perfect in love, do something that would be worse than us wicked evil people? So I do understand that you're broadening that conversation and saying Do you honestly think God's about to get rid of you because one day you walked by your computer and a thing popped up and it made you have, an impure thought? Everything else in your life has been, immaculate,
Yeah.
but you just happen to be walking past a computer at the library that day. And that's the one thing that's going to. So it's a very interesting conversation, because do we see God as, God is love, scripture, or do we see it as God is justice, scripture? Should we be afraid of God? Should we be at the end? So let me ask you this kind of thing, from your perspective then. If you're not dying and going to heaven, where have you resolved for your position? Because you talk about how Hitler would eventually have some kind of reconciliation back to God. Obviously, these people who are also walking in salvation, they would have that same kind of coming back to God moment. So everybody that we would talk about from the mainstream who's looking forward to a heaven, they almost in their mind have that picture of the streets of gold and houses and everything we see using that imagery in Revelation. And they think they're going to have a house with a garden, and they're going to go to this big castle and go and see God and Jesus sitting on the throne. If that's not the future, and that's obviously why we're having these conversations, is to challenge these concepts. What is it that, and I know these are hard questions because I don't have an answer for this question, but I got to ask anyway.
Yeah.
What do you see the Bible presenting for us as, well, this is what's coming? This is why, there's more to this. Is there afterlife? Is there not after? Is there conscious awareness afterlife? How do you see it?
Well, and we would see the Bible as addressing 100% of the temporal world. There's really nothing there that we can point to say that this is what the afterlife will be. And again, we're not trying to take away if people want to believe that they're going to have cotton candy every day and jump on streets of gold and that sort of thing. I heard a preacher one time I was with in a funeral. He was really mad because the NIV and other translations in John 14 was saying that, in my father's house are many dwelling places. He said, "Oh, they're taking my mansion away. I'm going back to that King James Bible where, in my father's house are many mansions. I'm going to a mansion when I die." And you know, I'm not going to argue with people if that's what they want to believe. But as far as my understanding of it, I'm not. I mean, I don't know. I'm sort of agnostic on the afterlife. That's why I say, as far as we can go, is just basically our bodies go back to the dust from which they came. Our spirits go back to God. I don't know exactly what that means. Uh, so I don't really know. And again, I'm fully aware of the full breadth of philosophical discussion throughout the centuries about consciousness, what it is. Does it go beyond to something else? What are we connected with? I just don't know. I try to focus more on, this is the life we have. Um, I really appreciate the book of Ecclesiastes. It's my favorite because it gives us the most honest look to just say, hey, this is the life you have. You better live this one to the fullest. If you don't, you may not get well, there's just no promise of tomorrow. There's no promise of an afterlife in Ecclesiastes. This is very, like myself. Of course, I'm a recovering cynic, so I'm always having to battle the cynicism that's in me, looking at the world around because I want to be an optimist. But we want to make the best of our life, uh, whatever it can be. Because again, I see so much suffering. Some of this has come from my social work background, working with lots of different people. I've got family that have different mental health disorders. Some people have either paranoia or bipolar disorder to where it makes relationships with them impossible. And all they do is just hurt people that's the closest to them. To me, that's just a miserable life. And it's incredible how many people are out there that are suffering with these sorts of issues. And for us to just say, hey, all you got to do is just believe in Jesus, to me, that absolutely spits in the face of people who, I'm sure either already believe or want to live life in a different way. But we don't believe in magic. We don't believe that just because you believe in Jesus and you're a disciple and you try to live this life, that you're not going to suffer from mental health problems and things like that. So that's why I say I'm not wanting to avoid giving an answer. I just, like you, I don't really have a good one. The only thing we can do for each other is to come alongside one another, love each other, and do our best to encourage each other wherever we are. And I think that's what life should be about. If we're just waiting for if this is just a dress rehearsal for heaven, do that, live your life that way. I just can't. just again, I want to make the best of what I've given now.
Those I appreciate you expressing that, because what I think with from what I'm hearing is it's a more of a focused view of what's important today, what we should be focusing on, in this world, which I can't argue against. I preach the same message. I think the view of futurism tends to create this "I don't need to live yet"
Yeah,
view almost, and we forget the importance of the experience we're here for. We're obviously here for something, and if it's just like you said, to wait until later, it's kind of, I equate that to people who think that we should sit around all day. God gave you a building, and half of it was legs. So in the same way, we're here for something. And what I hear you saying is, in a lot of your growth points, universalism is about applying a realistic, in this time period, and how do we relate with God in the midst of that. Would you say that's
yeah,
pretty fair?
yeah. And our universalism aligns with Paul's universalism. It's not about hey, just do whatever you want, everything's fine. That's not what we're about. And again, I'm not out here uh, protesting and telling people how they ought to live their life and things like that. But it doesn't mean that we believe you just throw all ethics to the wind and nothing matters. You just do whatever, and there's no consequences to life. There's always consequences to decisions that we make, and what we're around and surround ourselves with. Those of us that can do that. Now, there are some people that they don't have much choice in their life because, like I said, they have some maybe mental health issue that's you could throw 1,000 good decisions in front of them and they'll never do any of them. They'll find the one bad one. So there are people like that, and
Well, there's a lot of people that simply forget too. Like, Israel was thrown into Babylon. Well, there was entire generations of people born and dying in Egypt and Babylon, and in captivity. Like, there's entire people groups of covenant people who were born and died in slavery. So,
Mhm.
yeah, not everybody who is a believer or a covenant member, or however they see themselves connected to God, are destined for non-slavery. There's
Yeah,
children today that are literally born into the slave market,
yeah,
and they have no hope. Well, of
yeah,
course they do. They have the same hope we do. So I see what you're saying in the sense of trying to equate reality with religion, as opposed
yeah.
to trying to overlay a religious view and make reality skew to it.
Yeah, that's what happens oftentimes. And again, going back to saying, our understanding of Paul as a universalist is that he's universalizing the faith, because again, he's saying in the New Testament in various places, about it's not about being a Jew outwardly. It's not about the following of the law in the ceremonial sense or the personal sense, but it's the breaking down of these barriers that were holding back others, just like circumcision or other or the food laws that they had. So Paul pretty much was breaking all that down and just inviting everyone in, and we say, well, that shouldn't upset anybody. Well, I mean, we wouldn't have most of the New Testament if it weren't for these debates that they were having about should we be doing this? Should should we let these people in? And Paul saying, yeah. So that's why I say it's not that again we're saying nothing matters, that Jeffrey Epstein doesn't matter, uh, the pedophile islands don't matter. All people just do whatever they want. No, this is what frustrates me in a lot of circles with people's ideas of universalism. They automatically go to that point of, everything's right. That we're out here just saying it's all good. No, there's always ethical norms and debates, and we can all argue over these sorts of things. I probably wouldn't agree with a lot of them on what they would call a biblical moral or biblical ethic, because some people can skew those. And again, it's like you're saying, they're trying to take something that's an ideal, and it's just like was it Hume was talking about taking an ought and making an is out of it. Yeah, there's a way you can look at ideals, and it'd be nice to be that way, but every sort of eschatology suffers from that notion that there's the utopia out there. If we could just get these other people out of the way, or if you just listen to these ideas we have, or we have some some theory. Marx had a theory, and it's the same sort of eschatological framework, that there's a utopia out there, just like lots of people believe now in whatever system that it is. And really, evangelicals suffer from it so much, and I see it all the time. If they could just get the right person voted in, or if they could just get these evil people out of the way, that they could get the society that they want, God be happy, and but they've got the idea of God as some sort of Santa Claus that rewards good little girls and boys and gives coal and bad things to those that do naughty little things. And that's just this is why we put so much emphasis on what Paul says, that when I was a child, I spake as a child, but when I grew up, I put away childish things and I became a man. That we put a lot of emphasis on that in our tradition, because we say, look, there's a certain point you got to grow up and get past literal thinking, get past thinking that life is black and white. It's not always that way. There's a more complicated and complex world that's much more meaningful and scary, and that not everybody's going to embrace that. So that's sort of our understanding of salvation. Salvation would be akin to resurrection, because in our understanding of it is we must be willing to be torn down, have our egos, our old ways of thinking absolutely demolished, and be willing to be built back up to have this new understanding, which is more mature, which can embrace metaphorical thinking, can embrace complex thinking. Just like we've talked before about our understanding of the story of Adam. The story of Adam, to me, if all you get out of that is Adam sinned and that Jesus came as the second Adam and he did away with all that, if that's all you get, you don't need most of the Bible just for that. You just need a few verses. But and of course, I would recommend anybody to read James Jordan's work on this, but I don't think Jim Jordan came up with this on his own either. It's a long tradition, even in Eastern Orthodoxy and other traditions, where Adam is seen as somebody that needs to learn how to grow up, and you have to be tested. You have to have sort of the encounter that Adam has to know how to grow up to become a king, and to know how to go out into the wider world and face this more complex, complicated world. And you see that with the story of Israel. You see that with just the whole story of humanity. So there's a lot there. And again, just to say, I don't take those stories literally. We take them, when we say myth, we don't mean to dismiss it and say, oh, we don't really mean there's anything there for us to understand. There's a deep, meaningful, poetic, lesson to be learned there that just never, you can't ever exhaust it. So that's why these stories and scriptures are so powerful. It's and just because we don't believe in inerrancy doesn't mean we don't believe there's power in these texts and in these stories, because it definitely is. So.
Well, I want to just thank you for taking so much time here to kind of lay out some broad kind of ideas, because I think when you think of universalism, the ideas that come to your mind are those generic. Well, everybody's saved; it doesn't really matter anyway. Just go drink and
Mhm.
uh, proliferate sin as much as you can, because you only live once and you're going to die once, and it doesn't matter how bad you were; you're going to go back to God anyway. So uh, what I hear you saying is to contrast that is it's not really the idea. The idea that you believe is it's not the point and purpose of life is to die and go and to be with God, but rather the point and purpose of life is to live a life here reflective of the qualities that God has expressed in those writings.
Yeah.
And so universalism isn't really concerned with life and death, but rather than being alive while you're here as opposed to being dead while you're here. Would you say
Yeah.
that's an accurate, more accurate representation of kind of where you're coming from universalism?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I was trying to find a quote by Bishop Spong, and some people really don't care for John Shelby Spong, but this is one of the best quotes I ever heard from anybody, and I just a huge admirer of Bishop Spong. Believed really very closely to the views that we hold. But he said, "When I experience God as life, and God, who is the source of life, calls us to worship Him by living fully. The more fully we live, the more we make God visible." And I don't know how anybody could not embrace ideas like that. But it's what I say. We one gift that I would say the Christian Reconstructionists gave me, which is R.J. Rushdoony, Gary North, Chilton, Gary DeMar, others. Uh, I love the fact that in their conservative circles, they demolished the whole notion of escapism, that the whole purpose of salvation is to just get you to heaven so you can escape this old wretched world. I love the fact that they put in motion these ideas that we're here to be what God's called us to be. If God's calls you to be a garbage man and you pick up trash, that's the most spiritual thing you can do. Or if God's called you to be a lawyer, be a lawyer, be a linguist, be a data analyst, uh, be the best husband, wife. Uh, you know, uh,
It's actually paganism, if you really want to think about it, because it's a return back to worshiping the dead. Because what you're doing is saying, while we're alive here, you're meaningless. Yeah, that's
yeah,
not just life has nothing, but rather once you die, then you become something of value and exaltation. So we're actually back to Egyptian death worship, and we're now
yeah,
waiting for the dead in order to become something. So I tend to agree with that perspective, because what's the point of life if we aren't to live it? And we see that over and over again. And I can't disagree with that point of when you try to live according to the things in which you're taught in these scripts, then you are revealing more of God in this world. And whether people want to hear this or not, that's apparent in atheists, that's apparent in all religions. It's a core fundamental human outlook, and it's not subject to one religion. So I do see your point, and I think you make a lot of valid points where what I think you're going to cause people to do is not so much look at their Bible and say, well, what scripture is making you say that? But what you're saying is we need to step back as a whole and readdress the question of humanity and see where the Bible fits into that. Is that a fair assumption?
yeah. That's why I say it's. And this is always it's always open to those who still hold to inerrancy and they still have to prove everything. And again, those that hold to salvation by right belief will always go to the text and always try to tease out what the truth is. They've always got to be finding the truth. They're never happy with anything, and they're going to make sure everybody else believes their truth, what they perceive to be the truth, the gospel, whatever they want to call it. And because I've been there, I know what that's like. And I'm not saying I'm better than anybody. I'm just saying that these sorts of arguments will never convert someone like that, or will never sway them because they're right no matter what is said. That's why I say that it's easy to get into these back and forth with different texts because all texts are interpretations. And it all depends on your interpretation. Then we start arguing about which scholar in the Hebrew or the Greek, or which one is the most correct. And I mean, again, this is why, Dallas, we've said that we didn't want to have a debate because we see enough of this. I mean, it's so predictable that it always comes down to these things. That you're going to see text in different ways, and that's fine. That's what we should do. We should bring something so we can have a fuller understanding of what these texts could mean. They can mean so many different things. But
That's one of the things when I got from the universalist point of view, and I question people all the time with this, and see if if you want to speak to it or not. It's up to you. But it was one thing that never, ever, ever, ever sat right with me about Christianity or a one view in the sense of black and white. This is how it's got to be. Was it doesn't make sense that someone in Argentina is going to be rejected by God because they were born before Jesus existed and had opportunity simply due to the physical location in which they were made, in which God made them apart from it. How can God be love and I see unfairness? That's simple. So that was a big problem for me because even after that, it was arrogance, it's high level narcissism to then say that that Argentinian was still rejected by God until some white settler came across the sea with news of Jesus.
yeah,
So the whole position of God can't exist outside the Bible has never sat well with me. But in the same breath, I think everything that is written in the Bible reveals the true God, the true understanding of God actually interacting with the world, revealing to us the truth, and it is the most important document and sets of documents for us to be able to actually come to grips and terms with those. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, but that is something that has never sat with me well, which is the whole how can God exclude people simply due to physical location limitations in which he planted them away from their only opportunity. So I don't know. Do you have anything you would like to say to that?
yeah. That's why I say this was the first big question that I wrestled with in my life was the cognitive question. That's what I was talking about. That was the uniqueness of the primitive Baptists was they didn't believe you had to hear the preacher to come to faith. That that preaching or teaching that's a cognitive um, tool to help you understand what you already have. That doesn't give you faith or anything like that, because making man's cognitive understanding of the gospel the vital link in God's redemptive plan places man firmly in the driver's seat. It really puts a wrinkle in the whole notion of sovereign grace, because again, there are cognitive degrees. And again, this as I look back, one of the things I had a question about when I was a revival preacher was I was always told God's got one way of salvation. That's it. God's only got one way. You got it's the ABCs of salvation: accept, believe, confess. And you got to they always take you to Romans. The way you got to hear a preacher, you got to believe it, and you got to confess it. Well, I knew people that were mentally challenged, that were disabled, there were deaf people. My grandfather, my mother's father was deaf and mute. And I loved my grandfather. He never heard anybody preach the gospel, and he never confessed it. Um, but then these preachers I was around at the time, they'd say, "Well, now God's got a way." I said, "Well, I thought God just had one way. You all told me this is what we're preaching. God's only got one way." Well, no, God knows about them people. It's like, okay, so it everybody's always willing to give in a little somewhere, but when you believe that salvation is by some cognitive faculties that man has that you have to cooperate in this process in some way. In their understanding of salvation, I don't know how anybody's ever saved or how you can ever be satisfied you are. And it's no wonder people are constantly, I mean, we have people, I know friends and family locally that they're, going to the altar, they're praying, they're trying to get saved all over again. It's never enough. And they're always feeling guilty if they have any thought at all. And it's just the hamster wheel that never ends. And
I'd even suggest that's a very unhealthy, mentally and emotionally way of living as well.
yeah, this is why some people get out of faith and religion altogether, and they find salvation outside of that. That's why I say the term salvation can mean a lot of things. I know some people personally, and people can say what they want, say whatever you want about these people. One person I know personally, his father was a very strict Baptist preacher, and this guy grew up and he doesn't want anything to do with any of it. He is so sick to death of it. He was raised in a way where he has a lot of religious trauma that comes from abuse and different things. So he's found salvation outside of the faith. And I think that's a form of salvation. So, because again, some people can use ideas that seem good, where some people see a church building or a chapel, or they hear a bell and they have good nostalgic feelings about it. When I've done counseling with people over the years, there are some women that all they think about is rape and molestation. There are some men that just all they can think about is how abused they've been, or there's different degrees of that. Not and I understand that, but again, it's kind of, let's pull back a little bit from just reading the Bible. If all we're doing is reading the Bible and trying to prove Scripture, you're not really going to learn much in life. It's good to do it, but if you can't connect with people, I don't know how helpful any of this is. And I love to study I love to study Scripture. I've done it most of my life. I love to study all sorts of things, but I've always said, if I can't use this to connect with people and help them, then I'd give it up today, because it just wouldn't make a lot of sense to me. You're on mute, Dallas.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
One thing I can say I'm really thankful for in your presentation tonight is showing how much that from your position, your view is focused on trying to make this world, this time period, a better and more meaningful place for the people who are trying to experience more and meaningful things in this world. And I find it interesting how you connect that to God while at the same time trying not to disqualify anybody else in the same breath from God ever giving that same experience to anyone wherever they're at. So I can appreciate the level of mercy that it takes. That was the big hook for me when I came to my beginnings. It started with partial preterism and universalism. So I can understand and I can really see why the universalism view has a good, attractive position. Like, it brings real life and makes real life have meaning, where I think the church in general historically has actually stolen that meaning from a lot of people's lives. Like you said, it can be a salvation to come out from the religion itself. Mm-hmm. And I tend to agree. When we look back, the only reason why the Reformation had to take place was because people were so under the thumb of other people's control. So there was a salvation from the church itself needed at that time. Yeah. So I do appreciate what you bring forward there. And I'll bring this one idea forward. You can call it universalist if you want. You can call it whatever you want, but it's an exercise that I've come to understand as, this is how I've come to define what it means to love. And I always put it in this. I stole it from Norm Macdonald and made it my own. So he had a part of this, but I've tweaked it. So it's a little mental exercise I'll play here with you, Jonathan. And I just want to see if your response to it, because I think it's actually pretty cool. So just play with me into this theological conversation.
Yeah.
If we will say, and the assertion is God is perfect, would you agree with that?
No. Yes.
Okay, so if God is perfect, that means if God were to make perfection, he actually isn't making anything as much as he's just expanding himself.
Yeah.
Therefore, if God were to create anything that was good and right and equal with him, there's nothing being created. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so.
Therefore, that must mean anything that is created by definition must be imperfect. Therefore, God, knowing that anything he makes that isn't him is fundamentally going to be imperfect, but he chose to do it anyway. Why? In order to have relationship, to have experience, to have purpose, meaning, life, and everything. And I define that as the word love. That God, being perfect, created imperfection and chose to be with that imperfection in spite of that imperfection. And so to me, whether you see the world through a universalistic view or a non universalistic view, I think that mental exercise shows us that at the beginning, no matter where you look, how someone ends, I think the heart of God begins with every human from a universalistic point of view. Then we can have as many debates after that as we want. But I would be really interested to hear your opinion of that little kind of mind exercise there, because I think it's a wonderful way of describing maybe where God's mind was at the beginning and who we really are, because I'm not perfect and I created imperfection, and I love my created imperfection more than I love creation. So I can relate to that spirit that God put in me as I look at my son and go, "You're imperfect, but I love you perfectly."
Mm-hmm.
So, any thoughts to those ideas there, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think that's good. It's a valid way of looking at it. So I say, knowing the, I guess the changeableness, even of how we define terms like love or anything else. These words and terms mean so many things to different generations. So yeah, that's why I agree with you that I think God you could call perfect or unchangeable or eternal, and everything outside of God is temporal, changeable, imperfect. Is there's times I think perfect and imperfect. I question those terms, kind of like infinity. I question question that term sometimes too. These are constructs I know that we have that make sense to us. But yeah, I know
I've almost
there's
come to see it as more of authority than it is anything else, because what
yeah,
we're doing when we make those statements is we're determining, we're becoming that judge, right?
mhm,
We're now saying, it's actually kind of ironic now that I think about it. When I say God is perfect, I'm becoming God and declaring God perfect.
yeah,
So I'm actually transgressing God being perfect by me becoming God to declare himself perfect. It's really quite the ironic thing is, so maybe I'm catching myself in a whole other new can of worms I'm going to have to think about.
well, that's fine. I'm very much I'm very much an admirer of Wittgenstein when it comes to our language games, and I mean we do the best we can to construct terms that try to correlate with reality the best we can, and that's all we can do. We just do the best we can with it. That's why I say uh, those that would believe in inerrancy and these sorts of things, you'd have to have an inerrant mind or an interpretation to even comprehend such an inerrant word or an eternal word. That's why I say we're doing the best we can to understand these ideas. Uh, Whether people embrace my views or my universalism, uh, I'm not trying to evangelize people, and like I say, this is not an easy position to hold. So it's not so easy to hand out like candy and say, hey, you'll have your best life now if you'll just come to us, or you're gonna just feel like you've never felt before. Like, I can't promise those sorts of things.
Well, I would
Um,
tend to agree that the Bible shouldn't be read very basic and simply. We didn't invent terms like anthropomorphism because it is a simple book. So
yeah, exactly,
I want to thank you
exactly.
so much, Jonathan, for taking this amount of time to sit down and, again, that hot seat of being universal. And I know you didn't give enough of the answers, and I know you didn't give people the right answers. And I
Yeah,
know that we weren't going to be able to satisfy what it is, but hopefully, and again, people listening, I'm not universalist, but I want to have these conversations because it's not about, at the end of the day, us being right. Like where I am now, I was wrong 10 years ago. Where I am today, I was wrong 20 years ago. I'm going to be wrong 20 years from now. So it's not about bringing Jonathan on because I think he's right or wrong, but I do think it's really important that any serious study, student being looking at God, trying to walk a spiritual, a good life, we need to take the time to listen and be part of conversations. And we need to shed this religious spirit that says, I have an idea. This is the way it is. And now I'm just going to go and try and buddy up with other people who will agree with me and create a new tribe. We've got to get out of that mindset and stop drinking this milk. We got to get into this meat, and we got to start growing up and maturing and worrying about the weightier things of life. Sure, it's important to have a friendship society in which we can get to on a, once a week, and, have support and fellowship. That's very important. We're communal creatures, but we shouldn't just agree with them because they're our friends. We should go beyond that. And I think Jonathan has done a really good job tonight in this conversation, not necessarily converting anyone, which wasn't his goal, but maybe opening the door to, this life is deeper. The Bible's deeper. Maybe it's deeper than what you think. I know it was deeper than what I thought 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I hope in 20, 15 years, I will think that what I now know was pretty shallow. I want this to go deeper. And I want to thank Jonathan. I want to thank all my guests that I will be calling on to press into these conversations, because this is where we're going to grow. And we're going to do it by doing it with mercy and grace, not because I'm right and not because you're wrong, but because we want to grow. And the only way we're going to do that is by letting these swords come together and not kill each other. And that's what I've enjoyed, Jonathan. Hopefully, you've enjoyed being able to just speak
yeah.
and not have to defend. So, thank you very much for being here. I'll give you this last second here to, again, plug anything you want. Let people know where they can come check out. Maybe poke you with some questions and follow it up with what they might need to know about where you're coming from.
Yeah, I appreciate being here again, Dallas. This is great. I love to have these sorts of conversations. These are my favorite subjects. Again, I always enjoy this, the more theological, philosophical kinds of discussions. Just would say, I don't really have any books to plug. I don't really have anything to sell. And my one of my best friends always says, and of course he's one of our elders. He always says, "Man, you couldn't sell what we have anyway. I mean, we can't even give it away." So, but I really appreciate everybody, and I would say there is, of course, we had this. You and I had this discussion, Dallas. So many good resources out there to take advantage of with all the information. I know we're on information overload so much. There's so many podcasts. Everybody and their brother's got a podcast now, but there's so many good lectures out there. So many good just uh, scholars doing just fantastic, incredible work. And I'd ask you to just be remembering me. I know I'm going to be applying to do a PhD in psychology with an emphasis on theology. It's a concentration of how to kind of meld those two together through Liberty University. And I hope to be getting started with that this year, talking with them. And I think it's going to go through. Been wanting to do this for years, and just pursue nothing to, again, not trying to sell anything, just for my own pursuits, things that I'd like to do a little bit later in life. And I really hope it works out. So, and look forward to more conversations like this. And appreciate you, Dallas, and I'd love to have you on the Legion of Heretics sometimes if you'd want to come on and be with us and present something. We'd love to have you.
That'd be awesome. I would look forward to that greatly because I'm right there with you. Being on the edge, sometimes it's pretty lonely with all your weirdo ideas, right? And that's where I
Yeah,
find myself most of the time.
yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this. And just plug that again on Facebook. We got the Legion of Heretics, where Jonathan, just like me, with a better understanding the Bible, and my podcast, Challenging the Traditions of Men. We're talking about things that maybe people in general don't want to, and if you want to, expand your conversations beyond the normal, what we would see on a day to day, well, pop over there, the Legion of Heretics. If you can't get that from the name, I don't know how we're gonna move forward with any other conversations. So, thanks for joining us here at Better Understanding the Bible on YouTube. Thank you, Jonathan, again for joining me here. And maybe we'll have you come back. And depending on questions, the thing that I love about this is it opens the door for everyone to have some stuff, and maybe we can do some follow up later.
That sounds great, man. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and have a good one. Thanks, guys, for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.